Oops, sorry about that. Sorry, Matt.
No worries.
Literally, I had just clicked it as you started asking that. I think we're live, though. Very good. Yes, we are now streaming. So hello, YouTube. Welcome to another episode of a live streamed Growing Down podcast. We are here with Zaks Stein today. I'm going to queue up a little intro for Zak. So some of you who are already our audience are probably familiar with Zak and his work, Education in a Time Between Worlds. Essays on the future of schools, technology, and society. But Zak is also the author of Social Justice and Educational Measurement. Zak has been very active on places like the STOA and really the kind of meta-modern emergencia podcast network as we're exploring these questions and really trying to understand the age that we're in. Some of the things that I've really appreciated your What is Emerge essay series. And so we're really kind of exploring the time between worlds on this podcast. And we're kind of coming out of contextually a conversation with folks like Thomas Bjorkman on the concept of Bildung. And generally speaking, trying to have conversations with meta theorists on post-capitalism, a left-leaning progressive conversation, and just really kind of trying to unpack that. So maybe we could kind of start off with a simple question for you, Zak, and begin with how do you understand metamodernism specifically as like a categorical term for the times that we're in for audience who are kind of new to this concept?
Interesting. Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. It's good to be here. Last time I think we really spoke was at the 2015 Integral Theory Conference, if I'm not mistaken. So it's good to see you again. And
Likewise.
I may have weird audio quality because I'm on a Chromebook here. My main machine just died, which is why I'm late. Yeah, so I define metamodernism in a slightly different way than is defined by some other players in the field. I see it as a historiographical kind of epoch. So I don't see it as necessarily even a structure stage of culture or societal development, but rather something having to do with the way we think about historical periods. And so basically what's distinct about metamodernism is that it comes after, chronologically, modernism and postmodernism, which means that there's a moment in history, there's an epoch in history when you can be aware of both postmodernism and modernism and take the best of both and critique the worst of both and move forward into some new period. And so I'm not sure that it represents necessarily the kind of jump to second tier or the jump to post-formal operational cognition or even the turn towards a Gebserian integral stage of cultural development. But I do think it represents kind of the kind of climax of this historiological epoch, which began roughly at the end of the long 16th century. And the birth of the notions of the nation state, the genesis of the capitalist world system. And so I see I see metamodernism almost as like a liminal period when modernism, which is that phase, kind of exhausted itself and the new thing has not locked in yet, but the old thing is obviously no longer viable. So that notion of being in a time between worlds, the way I use that phrase is very similar to the way I would use a phrase like metamodernism. So I don't see it as a particular theorist or a particular theory. I don't see it having to do with certain meta-theoretical integrations, maybe not. But I do see it as when we are. And I think the time between worlds is a little bit more descriptive. And you can see it in the term, right? It's a prefix on modernism still. So like when the new thing emerges, actually, we won't have just prefixes on modernism anymore. We'll have an actual new thing. So that's a little bit of the metamodern term and a little little bit of the positionality. You know, the specific discourse in which I entered this modernism was one that emerged from the kind of diaspora of integral theory, specifically the Hansi Freunach Nordic metamodernism was my kind of introduction to that term, in which case you are looking at a way of doing metamodern theory that involves some of integral theory and hierarchical complexity modeling and a certain kind of comprehensive sociology. But I do think there's a lot of stuff that goes on right now, which is metamodern just by virtue of happening now. You know, so yeah, so that's a little bit of my thinking on the term, and I don't think I have the best definition or anything like that. It's the one that's useful in my work.
No, yeah, definitely useful. I think there's a similarity in your definition with Vermeulen and Van den Acker and their kind of precedent-setting essay about metamodernism, which is more of a descriptive attempt to articulate the times in which we inhabit as sort of being in between, and that sort of is the emphasis, even how they're using that word as well in terms of metaxis, right? Sort of being in between or being in a kind of a liminal state. So guys, Matt, Ryan, feel free to jump in if you've got a question as well. I don't want to hog the mic.
Yeah, Zach, thank you so much. I really loved your book. I also come from an education background, so I was very interested in sort of the marriage between integral and education. I was wondering if you can kind of riff a little bit on the idea of, definitely with COVID right now and everything going on, some of the things you've talked about in your book sort of coming true of kind of getting away from the brick and mortar sort of classrooms, and teachers are kind of having to improvise on sort of how to run their classrooms. I was interested if you could just sort of expand on this idea of the planetary integral paideia and how you see integral influencing or changing possibly the current direction of education in the United States.
Interesting. There's a few things in there. You know, so one of them is just the way the pandemic has fundamentally changed education and revealed certain systemic vulnerabilities within mass kind of national educational systems. And so you're right. When I was writing the book, you know, between 2017, 2019, basically, I was seeing the possibility for systemic collapse of educational systems due to a whole bunch of factors I didn't even consider pandemic. But I was looking at climate disruption and large scale migration and economically blighted urban areas and those kinds of things, which then kind of gut the educational system. So I was tracking the potential for kind of a cascading set of effects that would make large scale mass education as we've known it basically not possible anymore. And I had suggested, in fact, to a couple school leaders that they should build, while it's still running, while everything seems to be working fine, build an alternative, basically tech-intensive educational hub network, a distributed system within the town where you would have identified resources and identified, you know, pods of parents who are in interrelationship and those kinds of notions, my educational hub network. And have it as like a generator, like a backup generator, in case we can't go to school because there's storms or whatever. We can boot the alternative education hub network. And that ended up happening, not because I recommended it. No one took my advice at the time because they didn't see this coming. But now we've ended up in a almost ad hoc way building these hodgepodge networks that are similar to the model that I was suggesting. But falling radically short in a lot of ways. You know, the main event that's happening now is screen-based education, where you're having a centralized node of educational dissemination in like a large public school system, which is basically like streaming content to the screens of kids sitting around, you know, the city at home, basically. And that's one of like the dystopian scenarios that I lay out in the book, where kids are basically captured by the screen for 6 hours a day, any given the equivalent of didactic instruction and quizzes for that period of time. And so that's, I think, the main effect. But there are things emerging on the fringes and in the periphery where you're getting a move towards homeschooling that's completely unprecedented in terms of just the sheer numbers of students who are going to be homeschooled formally. So that means that moving into the next years, let's say 3 to 7 years, the implications of that downstream are going to be quite intensive. It's hard to predict, but I don't think we're going to go back to the large dinosaur kind of like massive, centralized, fragile educational systems that we've known for 30, 40 years. I think a lot of the distributed nature of what's happening now will be seen as valuable and maintained, I think, for better and for worse. So that's one thing. There's more to say there about the different types of situations and contexts that people are finding themselves in. There's not one universal experience of having kids in school during this pandemic. It's actually a massively stratified and differentiated kind of experience. And so that's important to get. And then the second bit about the planetary paideia, which is the main focus of my book, that's a bigger, like a more complex kind of visioning type question. So the term paideia comes from Greek, like polity. Right? The polity is like the polis, like the political body of, let's say, a city-state. The paideia actually undergirds and surrounds the political body as the kind of like cultural and specifically intergenerational kind of fabric of the society, which sets the tone of value and knowledge and other things that allow the polity to even function. And so, one of the main things that happens in civilizational evolution is not just the transformation of political structure, but a deeper transformation of the paideia, that the paideia itself transforms. And so I'm kind of plugging into this notion that as the technology and the economy shifts, the paideia is going to shift. And that, when you talk about post-capitalist futures, right, you actually need to talk about a new kind of paideia emerging first. That capitalism itself had a paideia. It had a theory of the good life. It had a notion of intergenerational transmission and a kind of set of values and beliefs about the world that were kind of brought up and into each child as they were raised, almost like the water that we're swimming in. That's what leads to the decision making that we're seeing now, and that's what leads to the forms of identity and the forms of attachment to any variety of things in life. So the vision I had was basically saying that as the paideias have shifted historically, right, and you could trace that, and I do that a little bit in the book, you've seen a consistent move towards an expanding, more cosmopolitan notion of the paideia, that the emergence almost inevitably of something like a planetary paideia, right, where the kind of body into which you're socializing the next generation isn't local and national, but rather planetary and cosmopolitan. That's the vision. And that the question of what that will ultimately look like is a question we need to be asking sooner rather than later. Basically, we're in a situation of planetary interdependence at the civilizational level, right? So the idea that like there's multiple civilizations competing, that's not really true. Like if we go down, China goes down with us. If China goes down, we go down with them. Like there's no escape hatch here for one particular kind of like civilizational block. So you're looking at a planetary civilization. Now it's at war with itself. That's true. And it's self-terminating. That's true. But until the paideia catches up with the technological lattice work, like what I sometimes call the planetary computational stack, which is the ultimate expression of this period of capitalist world system building. So until the paideia catches up with that, then and this is a pattern that's been pointed out a lot, we're running with really sophisticated 21st century technology on a paideia that's basically back in like the 17 or 1800s in terms of the nationalism and the forms of pedagogy, and even the notions of the good life being wedded to basically specific forms of capitalism and nationalism. So that's just saying that's kind of the painting that picture, and then the role of integral in that. Well, for me, I use the integral model specifically and explicitly in the book, so I speak about an integral planetary paideia. But it's probably more accurate to talk about something like integrally oriented planetary paideias, plural, which is to say that you wouldn't have integral theory, capital I, capital T, running the whole show hegemonically around the entire planet. Like that's a straw man version where you put integral in like the seat, when in fact emerging as a polycentric planetary emergence up into some kind of new way of doing basic principles and values, first principles, first values. So yes, that's a little bit more. I mean, there's the way I use the integral model specifically in my book is, we can discuss that, but there was no sense in which I was trying to suggest that the only way forward is through use of the integral model. But I do think the only way forward is through use of models comparable to the integral model. And that's why I said integrally oriented planetary paideias, plural. So kind of leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'll just let people give people a second to adjust their volume on the mic if they need to do that. So Zach, I really like your vision of what education could be like and how it's different from our current system. And so my question, as it relates to anything that emphasizes decentralization, self-organization, kind of doing away with the old centralized top-down command and control system of education based on the industrial model that we have today, right? So my question is always how that model will land with the most vulnerable and most disadvantaged communities. And there's no doubt that our current educational system, in spite of trying to be a universal public education, has a tremendous amount of inequalities in it for various reasons, right? In terms of how education is funded through property taxes and the economic inequality that presents, lack of materials and supplies and for students and so forth in different schools. So my question is, how does your vision enter into the conversation of really doing justice to these underserved communities, in terms of providing access to teachers, or any model that might place more responsibility on the parents as teachers or educators or whatever, where they may not have the resources or time or energy and so forth to have as equitable of education as people who are rich and advantaged and so forth.
Yeah, no, it's a hugely important question. I mean, to be honest, like the way my education reform thinking goes, I don't focus on the school. So to answer your question, I end up having to go to what I call these 13 social miracles. Because one of the consistent problems in education reform has been saddling the school itself with the burdens of accomplishing democracy and economic equality and all of these things, where the school can't possibly handle all of that. So if you're going to reform schools, you actually need to reform entire communities and kind of economic systems surrounding the schools. So in conjunction with the education hub vision that I lay out, which does in fact bring the child back into the fold of the community and ask for more engagement from community members, right? But it's also coming with several of the social miracles I suggest, including things like basic income guarantees, and forms of public oversight over public finance that are novel. So yeah, I'm right there with you, and what the pandemic is revealing, as I was trying to point out, were the pre-existing vulnerabilities within the mass education system that we had, which was already fractured socioeconomically. So the pandemic is actually amplifying the already existing socioeconomic inequalities, such that, as I was saying, the vast majority of students, and especially those students who are in the least economically advantaged situations, are getting the absolute worst possible schooling experience right now. They're stuck at home, they're watching screens for 6 hours a day. They're basically not learning at all. And they're in, whereas go to the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, and you've got wealthy people able to pull their kids out of school, being home in large, spacious houses, even possibly able to travel with their parents out of condensed urban areas into more rural areas. You're seeing the urban flight of those people who can afford to leave urban areas, and they're bringing their kids with them, and they're homeschooling them from the country, and involving other parents who aren't completely. So I think there's this basic thing we're looking at now, which is that the situation with economic inequality and educational inequality just got markedly worse, like since March. Like, and it's going to take us time to look at these numbers and figure out how bad it is, but the rich just got richer and given more potentiality to get their kids smarter, and the poor just got poorer and less potentiality to get their kids well educated. So that's just a fact. So from where I'm sitting, it's kind of like anything we can do to shake the Etch-a-Sketch and get some educational innovation going should be done, because it's kind of like, I'm not really worried about getting in a situation of creating, with at least the work that I'm doing, creating a situation that's more unequal, right? Like, because I'm moving in thinking about that as one of my main goals. So I think when you're pointing that sign of like, could this innovation make the situation worse? Could this innovation make the social justice situation more dire? Very important to do that when you're looking at innovations. In the education space, it is now not the people suggesting what I'm suggesting, but the educational technologies companies and the venture capital companies that are specializing now in educational startups around educational technology and charter schools, specifically online charter schools. So if you want to like lift up some rocks and look for some dirty things happening, like this is where you're going to be looking. The Education Hub Network model that I'm suggesting looks a lot like some of the spontaneous pods that are beginning to come together now among some parents. But without the support of the community and changes in the broader economic infrastructures that surround the educational circumstances, mostly my model is concrete utopian and not practical reform oriented. So it's worth saying too that it would be possible to implement some parts of my model without the other ones, and it would be bad. And that's a little bit like what you're seeing. Wealthy parents can move to the country and they can form pods with other wealthy parents and give their kids an incredibly powerful educational experience. And that's a little bit like what I'm suggesting, but that's not what I'm suggesting, because what I'm suggesting is whole urban areas being kind of like fitted with bespoke education hub networks that are tied into other forms of economic reform that raise the entire neighborhood and surrounding area up and into an educationally focused economy, period. And so there's a long conversation about that, but the only way, I think, into some new paideia, into into some new post-capitalist form of social organization is actually to find a new vision of what the whole society is working for. Right now, the whole society is working to make profit, specifically to stack fictitious capital, right? To stack paper that doesn't even exist. Whereas we could, as an entire society, be working entirely and intensively for the sake of human development itself. And so that's the education-centric society, which is the ultimate frame, kind of undergirding the Education Hub Network vision. So it's important to get that I'm doing concrete utopic theorizing, not educational reform. Like, I'm not attempting to say we can get the Education Hub Network built tomorrow. In fact, I'm saying something quite different. So that's a little bit of that. That's your question.
Yeah. It seems to dovetail with Thomas Bjorkman's work in the concept of Bildung, or as he was saying, a deliberately developmental society. And one of the very important points that he brought up in that conversation that I think I'm hearing from you as well is this sense of we can't myopically focus on, let's say, healthy organizational development, but rather understand that, say, a deliberately developmental society is one in which the entire society is benefiting from this general project of human flourishing, self-actualization, and that, the actualization of an individual student or worker or citizen is integrally tied to the actualization and the health of the community, and then therefore the culture as a whole, right? So I see what you're saying here seems to be very much socially oriented, but also, individually valuing. And yeah, I wonder if you want to comment on that.
And that's absolutely correct. And the Bildung notion is wonderful because it's a notion of education that transcends schools and schooling. And this is the kind of notion of education that I'm trying to work with as well. That in fact, when you're looking at the educational dynamics within a society, and if you only focus on the school, you're going to be missing a lot of what's happening in the society that's actually formative intergenerationally. So Bjorkman is saying things that I completely agree with, and Lee Anderson, their book on the Nordic Secret, Lee Anderson's books on Metamodernism and Bildung, they're speaking to that same idea of using the opportunity of metamodernism, this time between worlds, to refocus whole societal priorities onto the developing human, and specifically the developing human in that context of intergenerational transmission, and broadening that concern away from just schools, right? Because that's the thing. If we just improve schooling, we could make things worse. That's one of those strategies that could make it worse. We need to actually figure out how to suffuse the education and the culture with positive educational kind of manna, if I can use the biblical. Like, it needs to be such a common part of your experience in the civilization that you can't help but learn and grow. And so that's the vision. This was the vision of the Bildung, of the early Bildung theorists, Goethe and Humboldt, for example, who were massively influenced by my man Comenius. We're all thinking along the same lines of the emergence of not like a scientifically oriented capitalist society, which is what ended up eventually emerging, but the emergence of a human-centric society, of one where the growth of the virtuous human was what the society was about. And you could see how that could be subtly distorted and misunderstood as some kind of like focus on abstract individual self-interest, right? So you can see how, like, when modernity started, there was this focusing, away from the divine right of kings and towards the sovereign individual, that there was this opportunity where we could have taken this maybe education-centric thing and thought of sovereignty in this more richly characterized way. So in any case, so that's, you're right. The Bildung concept is very aligned with my Paideia concept. Yeah, kind of like fundamentally reorientings around education.
You guys want to jump in? Otherwise, I just want to mention, or maybe the next logical question is what are the practical pathways to reaching that kind of consensus in what we might call the social imaginary, right? I think this year, even though we've seen an extreme transfer of wealth to, the top 1%, or however you want to put it, Yanis Varoufakis has that interesting piece about the kind of shift of capital in August, sort of decoupling itself from actual workers and labor, et cetera, which is very disconcerting. But on the other hand, we have seen an organic rise of common-centric projects, even if they were temporary and transient. There's a very interesting essay I read that Michelle Bowen shared about commons food networks in Portugal, for instance, during the height of the pandemic, which have since been abandoned, but had for a time kind of reoriented everyone's focus to these mutual aid projects and common-centric projects. So do you see what are the viable paths to really getting that shift, right? The new idea that we're discussing here.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because it seemed a few things. It seemed like the pandemic was going to be the kind of disruptive crisis that could have potentially, like I said, shaken the Etch-a-Sketch animator and allowed a lot of things to be redrawn from some kind of strange blank slate. There was a kind of optimism about that when it started, and I kind of shared in that. But that doesn't seem to be how it is playing out. My sense is that there are situations that need to get worse before they can get better. So that's like my first response, is that I'm not feeling like there is an approach that can be taken, spearheaded by a particular group. That what we're looking at is a very distributed, emergent process. And so we're kind of like sitting in the middle of very complex dynamics of cultural evolution and thinking about what does agency look like in that kind of context. So I think just like in human development, it's often the case that you actually can't transform because you want to, that you actually have to transform because you have to. And so that's the situation that we're basically creating for ourselves as a planetary civilization, which is that the intensity of the human experience is going to be magnified, and the complexity of our interrelations is going to be thrust upon us. I've talked about that unbearable intimacy of planetary catastrophe. And so that is the context in which these kinds of problems have to be solved. It's actually not a context in which it's easy to do technical work, which is to say that part of the PADIA and the educational hub vision and all of this is technical. It's about literally building complex new educational organizations using digital technology in ways very different from how digital technology has been used. So there's like a whole complex set of like technical questions, but those actually, we can't even get started on those until we've done this bit of what I would call in my metapsychology insolment, right? That the first work that's actually going to happen here that's going to allow us to do any of that technical problem solving is in the domain of personality, character, insolment. And so that's the movement of the culture very generally, from the pre-tragic through the tragic to the post-tragic. And I've spoken about those stations before. So what I'm saying is that I'm not thinking that there's some specific thing we can do in the world of technical cognitive problem solving here. I think that work needs to follow from a deeper reckoning or grappling with the human situation in that domain of insolment. And so what that means is that we need to unplug from the exogenous sources of imagination and image creation within the psyche. And we need to find ways for the individual and collective emergence of new forms of image and imagination. And so it's kind of interesting. It's like we're in a situation of having to create a religion or something like that. Like we're in a situation of needing to find ways for the collective unconscious to express out of us and in the collective field a new vision of the imagination, a new vision in the imagination of what the human is, what it means to be human, the nature of personhood. That's actually arranging for that is what we need to be thinking about, more than arranging for how to get really complex distributed cognitive sense making happening, although that is essential as well. It's like we need to do that stuff or we all die. But prior to doing that stuff, we need to actually figure out who we are again. It's like when you go through a period in rapid, massive, almost exponential change in your external circumstances, right? Like very rapid, let's say in the period of a year, everything changes in your life, right? There's a period where you can keep running on the old identity, even though you're in a completely new context, or you need to figure out actually a new image of self, right? And so we are in that situation as a species, where if you look at the long 16th century, for about 400, 500 years, we have had to pedal to the metal, like full throttle, complete change of context for the nature of the human. And so we're playing catch up at the level of Insolment and culture and idea. But Insolment hurts. That transformation of identity that comes is going to hurt. So there's an intensity that's going to emerge. I don't know where it's going to emerge. I do know now that we're oversaturated with exogenous images. And so we can't even begin to reimagine ourselves because we're too polluted by the kind of like nightmares of the capitalism has generated within our imaginations. So we need to find a way to rekindle sources of endogenous image emergence and recreation, and then find for ourselves and for the collective new image of the human. So that's definitely not like a concrete prescription of something we can go out and do, but I'm saying this is actually what I'm tracking. When I'm looking at the culture evolving, I'm looking at that. I'm looking at the forms of image and metaphor that are dominating our imagination about ourselves.
So Zach, this might be a lot to unpack. In your book, you talk about you sort of talk about the influence of Wilber on your work, but also describe yourself as sort of not being a Wilberian. And I know when you talk about your recent metapsychology series of development, Insolment, and transcendence, I know in Wilber's most recent book, he seems to advocate more for the transcendence piece of sort of how do we convert to a soul culture. And I was just wondering, sort of maybe if you could unpack sort of why you don't identify as a Wilberian, and then also perhaps the role of transcendence in where we need to go.
Totally. Let's see. Why don't I identify as a Wilberian? I think probably because I don't identify as a anything. If I had to identify as something, you were holding a gun to my head and you were like, pick one, I might identify as a Wilberian, but I'm not, but I don't know. Well, we would have to see. But there's a few reasons really, which is that, I work with about a half a dozen different meta-theoretical and philosophical frameworks, which are comparable to Ken's integral model. Ken's is, so Charles Sanders Peirce being one of the primary ones, Roy Bhaskar being another one, and there are several more, some more or less obscure, some more or less classical, like Kant, for example, has had a massive influence on my thinking. And so when you're working with that many big philosophical meta theories, it puts any one that you choose to use, like if I take Ken's and I choose to use Ken's, I'm actually using it informed by all of the other models. Landry's immanent metaphysics, for example, is another one. So that's the main thing, is that I've actually suggested a kind of, having multiple meta theories on hand to deploy. And when you're making those choices, because so many of them are so resonant, or they kind of echo one another, and there's similar patterns in them, what you end up finding is that you're kind of operating with all of them at once. You choose one of them because you're hearing echoes from the other models. So Ken's work, is aesthetically and heuristically just extremely powerful, which is one of the reasons that I use it in my book. And it was also one of the ones that I kind of cut my teeth on in a serious way as a young person. So it was kind of like left a permanent deposit in my thinking, I say in the book, quoting Dewey. So yeah, it's in fact not anything to do with problems with the model. It only has to do with how good other models also are, and kind of like how powerful it is to work with multiple models. So that's the bit there. But yeah, Ken's new book, The Religion of Tomorrows, that's the one you're referring to. Yeah. Great book. I read it right when it came out. And there's something extremely powerful that Ken has been doing for as long as Ken has been writing, which is trying to basically save religion. Like he's trying to save the traditions, essentially. And that's where this notion of what is the moment of transcendence now that's being called for, as you're asking, comes in. So in the model that you mentioned, the metapsychology model, development, you have these stages, and then in Insolment, you have these stations, and I mentioned one of those, like pre-tragic, tragic, post-tragic. In transcendence, you have this notion of phases, and then the dynamic of symbolization, and specifically symbolic immortality being the modality of transcendence. And so basically what I'm seeing now is a huge move within culture towards transcendence, because and mostly in the modality of altered states of consciousness. Right. So there are forms of symbolic immortality which don't involve altering consciousness, but involve identifying self with a transcendental operator or symbolic identity proxy, right? So like the way you can attach yourself to your people, or you can attach yourself to your nation, or to your biological line as a family. That's a form of symbolic immortality, which relieves the burden of the individual to accomplish all things and puts it in continuity with the sweep of history and biology and life. But I think as we're approaching this kind of like moment of major transformation, and there's this dawning of the catastrophic and existential risks, there's a disinvestment from the story of history and civilization, and even the story of family and the story of life, and an investment in transcendent states of consciousness, where what you're feeling symbolic immortality through is basically continuity with reality, as such, consciousness as such, or symbolic forms that emerge in awareness, not finding symbolic immortality by sacrificing yourself on the altar of civilization, or sacrificing yourself on the altar of family, or an ethnic group, or art, or something, right? So I think one of the things that needs to be found is, first of all, roping people back in from the ayahuasca trips and meditation retreats and DMT and all of these things that are basically where they're finding the symbolization to give them the needed sense of symbolic immortality. So I'm saying the reason these are attractive is because we don't have sources of symbolic immortality elsewhere that are viable. So that's part of the dynamic. So we need to pull back in from the up and out forms of transcendence and reorient to the forms of symbolic immortality that can emerge in the context of community, family, history. And so again, that looks a lot more like religion, quote unquote, than it does like spirituality. And so that's just one of these things that's worth noting, is that in fact there's been an uptick, I believe, a major uptick in people seeking transcendent type solutions to the kind of issues of life, which is important, because you could just seek the developmental solutions, which is to just become smarter, more effective, more efficient, self-optimizing flow state CEO guy. So instead, that's one way to do a solution, but you can also find solutions to life with the transcendent dimension, right? And then how do we do that in our culture now? It's not by becoming like religious. It's by having altered state experience forms of spirituality, which are legitimately transcendent, but they pull the identity out from its engagement with history and the rest of the domains of life where you can actually also find symbolic immortality. Yeah, so that's a little bit there. So I do really think it's hugely, they're all three are important. We actually do need to become more complex, more effective, more efficient, more developed, more hierarchically complex. We do. And we need to become deeper, more ensouled, richer character structures, post-tragic. And we need to have really robust forms of symbolic immortality and feel continuity of our life with reality in all domains, not just in transcendent consciousness, but in body, life, community. These are actually places where transcendence can be found. Some of the evidence of that comes from the work done around the effects, the psychologically positive effects of doing service work, caregiving work. So that's an example where you're actually finding transcendence, not by altering your consciousness, but by acting in the world in a way where you initiate a kind of causal sequence that then moves beyond you and causes good in the world. So that's a little bit there, but it is key. But any of the three taken out of perspective can become pathologized. So a little bit what I'm saying here is that you can hypertrophy and pathologize and overdo the transcendent, especially when you make the transcendent about altered states of consciousness. You can also overdo the development bit and just all you're worried about is becoming more hierarchically abstract and complex and second tier or whatever. And you can overdo the Insolment bit and get stuck in drama and trauma and stuck in endless psychoanalytic work and circling and things of that nature. So you really need to balance the three. So yeah, that's a little bit more in there. It's a good question though.
Yeah, that might tie in well with my question on your chapter on measurements, which was by far my favorite part of the entire book, and something I've I can tell. I mean, it's something I'm so fascinated with, and actually a lot of philosophizing on before reading your stuff. And so to see all of your thoughts so succinctly and put down so well thought out was just really exciting for me. And so my question is, how do we go about with a new measurement system, right? Enacting a new integral metrology, right? In an ethically sound way that doesn't lead to some of the problems, the traditional problems associated with measurements, such as measurements being corrupted, measurements becoming targets and no longer serving as effective measurements. Or, especially when you get into talking about measuring, I have your book here right in front of me, like measuring interiors. I love this phrase you use, right? A dynamic integral measure of the allotheic truth of inequality, including indices of interiority, health, education, human rights. So as we're changing the measures to illuminate these new values or unearth old and outdated meta narratives and to bring them to light and then replace them with something more dynamic and complex and holistic and organic. How do we do that in a way that doesn't end up like colonizing the life world, right? Or end up sucking our interiority into this abstract instruments or apparatuses of measurement in the kind of that may be associated with a kind of like 1984 surveillance state kind of like, does this make sense? Like how do we go about it to avoid that trap?
It does. I mean, first of all, we have to ask that question. Like most of the issue with measurement is that once measures are established, they disappear into the backdrop of the taken for granted kind of structures of our lives. And so indeed, I think one of the most pressing issues on the table right now as a planetary society is the emerging planetary computational stack, which is actually a planetary measurement metastructure, which synthesizes all, this is sometimes called the Internet of Things, but the Internet of Things is actually a vast sensor, actuator, and measurement network. And so what you're getting is, in fact, the entire planet being encased in a computational stack where everything on the planet will be measured. Right? Like this is actually the telos of the thing. Like this is the goal. Like when people talk about blockchain, for example, a lot of what they're talking about is being able to tag things in such a way that there's an indelible, indestructible index of the thing that can now be basically put on the ledger for all time. It's accounting, right? Accounting, count. The most basic form of measure is the count. And so what we're looking at here is, in fact, sneaking up on everybody is the most complex and invasive measurement metastructure ever created. That's not just using physical measures, but using psychological, psychometric measures. So what I'm saying here is that, yeah, we need to ask that question. Like we're in a situation, just like at the end of the long 16th century, when the very first inklings of a planetary measurement standard started to emerge, which eventually became the metric system, which took the French Revolution to get the metric system. So you're looking at, again, another historically significant transformation in the measurement infrastructures that structure our entire lives together. So like we're in one of those moments where we're making that future structure right now, and no one even realizes that we're like stepping into a future that's where we're going to be hyper measured across all dimensionalities of our existence, where we move, what we say, what we're feeling, what we buy, right? All these biometric indices. Like if you think about the situation with the pandemic, it's actually shown a spotlight on medical measurement. There's a massive medical measurement infrastructure that is involved in all kinds of political and economic intricacies, including insurance and litigation. And so the point is not that there's one, I think, best way to think about moving forward ethically with these, because each of these domains requires really minute concern about what constitutes good and bad measurement practice on the ground, right? But I am saying that we need to start thinking very, very carefully about this massive planetary measurement metastructure that accompanies the planetary computational stack, which is the new reality that we're moving into. And so, yeah, you're right to raise that question, but it is at this point mostly unfolding behind the scenes. And, the degree to which people take measures that are handed to them at face value because they're handed to them by authorities is also interesting. That the ability to decide what counts as a measure and what doesn't count as a measure is not a scientific question, it's a political question. And we're seeing that again with COVID diagnostic tests. So it's important to get that, yeah, the future that's coming is one in which the few measure the many by means of measures they've devised. and the many often have no access to those measures. So this is I'm describing Facebook right now, right? So Facebook measures you with a whole complex set of psychometric tools, sells your profile to advertisers to make a bunch of money. That's the main way Facebook makes money. It's the same way Google makes money. So this is Zuboff, right? Surveillance capitalism, that you're extracting behavioral surplus and then repurposing this behavioral surplus to sell to advertisers. That's all a massive measurement infrastructure. They're measuring you. A few people are measuring a shitload of people and then not telling them what the results of those measures are, and then selling those measurement instances to other folks, right? So that metrological injustice is what I call it in my first book, metrological injustice, where you are subject to measures over which you have no choice or control. So one of the first places where this is going to hit hard, and it's probably already hitting hard now with Social Dilemma, which just came out, Tristan's documentary from the Center for Humane Technology. One of the first places we need to just surface all the measurement that's happening is on the internet. I mean, every mouse click is measured. It's remarkable and unnerving. And so the degree to which we can actually show, well, this is actually what's happening. We're being measured every day, 24/7, and we don't even get the results of those measures, and we didn't even decide that we wanted to be measured, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so there's a lot of kind of like revealing of those basic measurement structures that has to be done before we can even begin to address your question. People have to realize this is a question that needs to be asked. And that, yeah, measurement is actually the crux of a lot of issues. Yeah.
Great. I wanted to ask, this is a question from one of our listeners. Ellen was asking, how do we get them, and I guess this is good in the context of speaking about measurement and metrics, how do we get them to even listen to us, especially public education? Being so cognition, academic oriented, how do we get the systemic layers of, say, federal Department of Education or the state, superintendents, school district boards to consider these new ways of being?
Totally. Well, there's two answers. One is that I would say, question the assumption that you want them to listen to you. That would be my first thing to say. Like, it is possible that some of the things that we know need to happen in education can't be accomplished within existing structures. And this isn't trying to be discouraging. It's trying to say that actually it may be not worth the time, that a better use of time and energy is to build the thing that needs to be built now, even though it can't scale and will never be like a national model, and you'll get like 15 kids or something positively affected, that's actually a better use of time than spending your entire career banging your head against the wall trying to change federal policy, which is basically rigged against you. So that's one thing. And this is kind of like the game A, game B thing. Like, can you really fix game A? Or do you need to just find some place where there's enough safety that you can just do game B? And so that's what I'm saying, is that, and the pandemic has created spaces where this could be potentially possible. And if things don't recongeal in quite the same way, there could be a lot of room at the fringes for stuff to be happening, which is just demonstrably better than what used to be happening amongst those same children. So that's the first response, which is why go into those halls of power trying to wield power when you have the power to build something really constructive right here and affect a small number of people around you in a positive way. So that's the first bit, which is that there's always this intention to scale and to change the whole system. And then maybe now is not the time to do that. We need to create pockets of innovation and sanity. So, but if you did want to go in there and you did want to argue with them and basically try to find ways to rearrange the current system, the main thing you would have to focus on is twofold. You need to learn how to speak the language of human capital theory, right? So the dominant meta theory of education that plays in policy reform discussions is human capital theory. So you need to be able to use their languages and characterize arguments in their terms and basically make integral moves in non-integral language games. So that's the first bit. So learn their language. Don't go in there and try to tell them about socio-emotional learning and like the heart chakra and, you know, Insolment and transcendence and all of that stuff. Like that's a non-starter. You actually need to go in there speaking their language, and there are really good arguments to be made that by their own lights, they're failing, which is to say, even by their own definitions of economic rationality and human capital theory, the schools are a disaster. So this is the arguments I used to make with standardized testing, that just look at it. They haven't made it better. You're desperately wanting to say that they've made it better because there's all the sunk costs into the standardized testing infrastructure. But if you look at the nature of work productivity in particular, there's a weird, almost inexplicable decline in U.S. worker productivity that correlates with No Child Left Behind. So it's those kinds of arguments which you need to figure out how to make. And there's a whole variety of them, you know, that music class actually increases math scores, you know, that mindfulness meditation actually helps kids take standardized tests. But you can see how I just structured those arguments that I don't actually want to make those arguments because I don't want kids to take standardized tests. And I want music class to be valuable for its own sake, not as some, you know, benefit of efficiency to the overall machine. But if you want to move policy, this is the way to do it. To use their own arguments in such a way that you can basically demonstrate to them in their own terms that they need to take this alternative direction. So that would be the main thing. And then it's also worth noting that most of the main effects within U.S. public education, or not most, but many of them, have not come from the federal government. They've come from private philanthropic money, right? The so-called billionaires boys, the Billionaire Boys Club. So the other way to actually affect large-scale public education change is through affecting the decision-making of the philanthropic sector. So instead of trying to lobby senators and congressmen and work with policy wonks to change laws, find a way to change the incentives around educational philanthropic donations. That would be a huge, like if you could find a way to reorganize how philanthropic decision-making is done in the domain of education, it would change a lot. And there's a few players, you know, Gates and the Waltons and a couple others. So there's some answers, you know, but yeah, it's an uphill battle. It's deeply politicized at this point.
Thanks, Zach. One of the reasons I got into education was, I think, related a little bit to your idea of the unique self theory. And some resistance that I think I found in my own educational experience was the feeling that you're on a track and in the system, there's really no, I'm not sure if I'm using your teacherly authority in the correct manner, but the ability to identify sort of what makes this person unique, and even listening to the student about what it is that he or she would like to do. And I guess my question is a little bit sort of with the idea of, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, of the daemon, or of our own calling. And what I was just wondering, sort of, it seems to be a panacea in the sense of, if we can identify sort of what an individual wants to do and really nurture that, it seemed to be a cure-all for all. But what I find in my experience, and even going through high school system, university system, is they want you on a track in a system to spit out a product. And really, in between those stages, you don't have anyone that sort of, maybe like a school counselor if you go and see them, but someone like that can identify what it is you want to do and really nurture you around that idea, rather than just sort of putting you on a track and getting you sort of out the system as a certain product. So I was wondering if you could just sort of expand on that unique self theory, and if you see any holes as far as what I presented.
No, I mean, you're right. Like, and all good educators know this, that, the only way to really get a kid passionate about what they're doing in school is to somehow attach what they're doing in school to their unique self, right? To the soul root, to the dynamics of the image, of the actual image of the self that is driving the development of character and personality. It's from that position that you can build skill development. Otherwise, you're not going to remember anything because you don't care. So, a few things to say. One is that, early modern education was predominantly a homogenizing function, right? So it was standardizing in a simple way. We moved into kind of postmodern education, and you got something like, instead of just simple standardization, you got standardized differentiation, right? And so now some people think this was some kind of improvement, right? That in fact we're actually somehow closer to unique self by virtue of having less homogenization and more customization or standardized differentiation. But the truth of the matter is that you are still being differentiated in a standardized way into a limited number of tracks, as you're saying. So the difference between standardized differentiation and uniqueness is one of the things that has to be basically worked with at the level of educational organizational design, right? So you see what I'm saying here? It's like, this is actually a question of how we build educational organizations and the assessment systems within them, to the degree to which we can have an educational kind of organization that evaluates students and produces graduates according to standardized differentiated categories, or an organization that educates students, sends out graduates that are actually, each one of them, in a category of their own, which is to say unique self. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out right now. We know how to do standardized differentiation. And by the way, that's what Facebook's doing to you. And all of the marketing targeted psychometrics, they're trying to figure out which of the however many hundred categories you fit into. So pushing through the standardized differentiation to actual uniqueness is the kind of allure of the advertising psychometrics. So that's the first comment, which is like, this is actually a very difficult issue in educational organizational design. So if you're working one-on-one with a student, let's say like Rousseau and Emile, then you can actually work with the unique self in a very detailed way. And good educators like it when they have fewer students, precisely because they can basically work one-on-one with the uniqueness of each student. As soon as you start to move into larger forms of mass instruction, it becomes a lot harder to get attention to uniqueness. And so that's a logistical problem that has to be solved. From a psychological perspective, I kind of already laid it out. That's the royal road to learning, and it's the royal road to both transcendence and development, is getting the Insolment solid, which is the clarification of the image of self. And then from that, motivation and emotion just flows out into the other domains of the psyche, right? So this is what the kids always say in school when they get labeled with obstinate defiant disorder, right? They're basically saying like, what does this matter to me? Like, except for the fact you're going to punish me if I do poorly or something, what does this actually matter to me? Like, give me an answer to that, and then I will pay attention. So we need to be able to answer that question. We need to be able to show exactly how this skill building exercise ties into the heartstrings of the student and is like along the trajectory of their Insolment path. And that can be done for many things, even things that seem like rote work in mathematics. Good teachers can link it in if they know the kid well enough. But then there are some things that school has you do which will never be a part right? So yeah, you're right to see uniqueness as the key to pedagogy, and it is. And so is Insolment, even though pedagogy is usually often about development, which is to say it's about building capacity, facility with language, skill acquisition, all that stuff. But the only way to get that done is actually to tie it into the unique self and to motivate it from that area. So yeah, that's a fancy way of saying intrinsic motivation as opposed to extrinsic motivation. So yeah, how's that? I could say more about unique self theory, but that's like a whole mouthful.
No, it's perfect. I'm still wondering why I have nightmares of algebra, and I was hoping I think you just answered it. So thank you.
This is why many people have nightmares of school, which is interesting. It's like very common that you're late or can't find your locker or in the cafeteria naked. Like it's a whole dream landscape of school-related anxiety dreams.
Just got a couple more questions. One is sort of a follow-up, I think, to the education one in terms of institutions and working with them or not. And this is from Kari mentioning kind of the in the context of the current polemics of the culture war, but he was asking, will we reach a point where it has strategic viability to retread the ground of historical materialism, both Marxian and post-Marxian, interfacing with extant Marxists and anarchists, or will we continue to see a thread, let's say in metamodern or integral circles, where this ground is reinvented and avoids those groups and inquiries altogether to avoid people's cultural allergies to words like socialism or labor or bourgeois or proletariat? Now, before I close there, I would want to add a caveat, which is I don't think integral and metamodern circles have necessarily done a good job really subsuming those insights, metabolizing them themselves, and carrying on. As we've seen, I think, in the integral world especially, there's been a kind of orientation towards radical centrism or transforming consumer markets, and that kind of those secondary and tertiary strategies of kind of working within the system to kind of move it a certain way, working with philanthropists, working with conscious capitalists, etc. So I want to add that caveat that I don't think integral and metamodern circles necessarily done that, but it is an interesting question about how do we language this. And also, for me, I think there is a similar question in those left-leaning communities in terms of how do we do a mass-scale labor movement in the 21st century? What are the kind of languages and contexts in which we should be using? So I don't know.
Did we lose him?
Uh-oh.
Yeah, let's just roll with that then.
Cool. Yeah, very interesting. Kind of set of questions there. Let's see, what's the best way into this? So I'll say a few things. One is that we're in a situation, as has been noted, where certain words and certain terms have started to function almost like, I don't know, gang signs or something, right? That you're like flashing allegiance to a particular ideological camp by virtue of, using certain words, and then, basically this makes it impossible for discourse to happen. So I'm hearing the question in that frame of like an over politicized culture where even if you're coming with a completely reasonable argument, if you can get labeled as a socialist, you are now not having to be listened to, right? Or if you're labeled as a capitalist, you're now not having to be listened to. So this kind of like disintegration of actual conversation for the sake of tribal allegiance. So that's the first privilege, and that's true. And so basically, if you say you're a Marxist, then you just basically disqualified yourself from being able to participate in certain kinds of conversations. If you identify as a free market capitalist, similarly, now there's a whole group of people who just simply won't listen to you. And there's a bunch of reasons of why the culture got into that state. But given that it is in that state, then we do actually need to find really innovative discursive strategies to rekindle the possibility of actual conversation and reasoned discourse. And so what that means, I think, is that actually if anyone's coming with a single model or single framework approach, it's going to be a non-starter. So if you do want to rehearse historical materialism and resuscitate Marx, this is wonderful. I've spent a tremendous amount of time actually engaging with Marx and learned a lot. You also need to be conversant in the key criticisms of Marx and the models that Marx was criticizing, which did not go away. Now, if you're dyed in the wool Marxist, then you believe they didn't go away because of the power of oppression and the capitalist state and all of these things. But it's also possible they didn't go away because there's a big moment of truth in many, if not all, of the predominant frames and theories that have survived and that have large-scale allegiance to them. So what I'm saying is that, yes, resuscitate Marxism, but not if you're going to run with a single or mono framework, mono epistemology. We actually need something much more complex so that every time you speak in a way that could have you labeled as a socialist, you're also able to do something and say something that allows it, that makes it so that it's almost impossible for them to simplistically apply the label to you, right? I do think it would be a mistake to believe that any of the single models or frameworks that have been produced about economics or politics, etc., that any of them is the one, right? Then in fact, we are looking for something new, and it's going to be multi-model dialogic process of building it. So yes, will a moment come to basically bring all of those past models into the light? Marxism, capitalism, authoritarianism, democracy, meritocracy, egalitarianism, like these are all strong arguments for all of these. So all of them need to be brought forward, and we need to actually find a way to work with a multi-modality epistemic way of operating, basically. So this is like a complex answer that I'm saying is like, yes, we need a lot of rigorous scholarship, but we can't be rigorous scholars the way scholars worked in the 50s and 60s, man. And thinking that like Marxism was the answer. This is just that we know way too much. There's so many more models that are at our fingertips, which complement and question and problematize Marxism. And same thing with capitalism and market ideologies and political ideologies. So the push here is towards a qualitatively more complex and adequate way of doing discourse, rather than a push towards bringing on particular models and making them prominent. So it's kind of a little bit of a meta answer, but yeah, Marxists better be on your reading list.
There we go.
But so should Adam Smith, and so should the Austrian economists. Like there's a lot of important discourse that needs to be under your belt, so that when you get into conversation and when you begin to write and when you do other things, that you are not recreating the errors of the model or singular epistemology that you're coming with. This is what is meant by integral, I think. That there's a refusal to be committed in a simplistic way to one model, and a very strong commitment to a multi-model complementarity and the model of truth in each of the frameworks kind of way of operating. I think if we can find ways to argue like that, then we could actually rekindle something like a public sphere where there's actually discourse happening, instead of just the retribalization and the hyper
No, that's great. So as a closing question for you, one of our listeners is asking, they'd love to hear about any of your current efforts to grow these integral Paideia projects, and if there are any particular challenges that you're facing in this work right now.
Yeah. So the main work that I'm engaging now is part of collaboration with Daniel Schmachtenberger. He's actually about to be on Rebel Wisdom, announcing a little bit about this project that's unfolding. And it's basically an attempt to work at the level of the digital media ecology itself. So basically, before we can begin to think about fixing schools, before we can begin to think about saving the rainforest, and before we can begin to think about fixing the economy and all of these things, we have to get our actual media landscape and communication infrastructures coherent. Because right now we can't even decide if there's a problem in the schools or not. We can't even decide if COVID is dangerous. As a country, we can't decide if China is good or bad, right? We can't, like, there's no sense of shared coherent reality within the culture in general, and that's the condition for the possibility of a Paideia. That's kind of one way of thinking about the Paideia. So instead of focusing on school reform and more traditional forms of educational work, I've been focusing around basically redesigning media as a basic educational infrastructure of society. So that work's very interesting, and it's very aligned with what I've been describing here, where we want to run meta news analysis, right? Where you look at a story, but then you look at every story about and track all of the possible themes and steel man each of the different perspectives on the argument, and then lay out through visuals like a display of just how complex and incoherent the informational landscape is. So that's an example of some of the work we're doing. And then educational pieces, which include models like Marxism and McLuhan and libertarianism. And it's like we need to get all of this stuff together in one educational offering and presented in a manner that is demonstrably not part of the information warfare, but is actually kind of like part of the peace movement trying to diffuse all of the informational weaponry. So to the degree that Marxism is wielded like a bat or a weapon, it's not part of a discourse. So we need to find a way to present it that is palatable and brought forward into a broader discourse. And similarly, with any of the other models, they need to be made suitable for use rather than suitable for weaponry. So in general, the project is one where we're going to make an attempt to both run meta news analysis on the current landscape, which ends up being a little bit like a sense-making laboratory, putting out its findings. And we're also going to be trying to provide resources to allow people to build their capacities as sense makers under current conditions. So that means, again, presenting all of the most useful models for analyzing the global situation and the media landscape, and presenting all of the relevant inventories of disinformation, informational warfare, propaganda techniques, psychological operation techniques to make these things available and visible, because they're all being used against us all the time. So that's the main focus now, is actually before moving into anything that looks more like traditional school reform or education reform, this piece of our culture and civilization needs to be put right first, because we can't even, there's nothing like a coherent public sphere that would allow us to come together to decide how to reform education. First, we have to figure out how to talk to one another and how to re-engage with an informational ecosystem that we trust. So that's a little bit of that, and that'll be coming in the coming months. Like I said, on Rebel Wisdom, Schmachtenberger will be speaking a little bit more directly to that.
Great. Thank you, Zach. Where can people find you online? And where can we find you? I know you're off social media lately.
Yeah, there's no social media, so Zak Stein .org, ZAKSTEIN.org. And that's it. My email's there if you want to email me. So cool, man.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks a lot. Talk to you again soon, hopefully.